welcome to Gathered.how. In today's video I'm going to be showing you a really easy guide for how to do foundation paper piecing. If this is new to you, foundation paper piecing is a way of sewing small pieces of fabric to a paper template to produce really neat and clever patchwork shapes. To get started you will need a paper foundation paper piecing template. I've used one from Love Patchwork Quilting magazine, and some small scraps of fabric. You'll also need something to cut your fabric. You can either use a rotary cutter and ruler or just a pair of scissors. So here I'm using some scraps from previous quilts that I've made. This is a really great technique for using up fabric scraps from your stash. All foundation paper piecing patterns have a series of numbered sections, and to get started you need to find section number 1. Turn your paper over and hold it in front of the light so you can see where section 1 is. Take a piece of fabric that should be larger than section 1 by at least a quarter or ideally half an inch all the way around. Pin the fabric to the back of the paper template, so at this stage your paper is upside down and your fabric is right side up. So the wrong side of the fabric matches the back of the template, and then pin that fabric in place. So you need to just make sure that it covers that whole section 1. Now the next section we're going to look at is sewing something to section 2 of the paper template. To do this you need to find the numbered section 2 and get a piece of fabric that is larger than that section, again by a quarter or ideally half an inch. So here I am checking where section 2 is by holding my paper template up against the light a little. And I'm going to take this piece of fabric, which again is larger than my second section, all the way around, leaving a seam allowance. And you're going to pin that second piece of fabric so it's right sides down, so right sides facing with the first piece. So take this second piece of fabric and pin it so it's upside down, so with the right side facing downwards. And this is where things get clever, so you're basically going to sew your sections flipped reversed. So take this piece of fabric face down and you want it to overlap that seam line where you're going to be sewing by at least a quarter of an inch. So you can see here we're sewing this second section 2, and on the back to do that we've got a piece of fabric pinned to the reverse of our template. And we're going to sew along that line so that once we've sewn, when we flip the fabric back against the sewing line, this fabric will cover the second section. So check a couple of times that you're happy where you've placed that fabric. Go to your sewing machine, and for foundation paper piecing, one thing to note is as you sew you're also going to be perforating the paper. So change your stitch setting to stitch length 1.5. Now sew along the line between sections 1 and 2, leaving a few stitches either side of the template line. Now you can remove that pin, and once you've sewn that line, when you flip your fabric back on itself, it will cover the area of section 2. Foundation paper piecing can get bulky, so in between each stage you fold the paper back on itself and trim a 1/4 inch seam along that line that you've just sewn. I do this by hand with a pair of scissors, but if you prefer, you can do this with a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. To ensure you get nice and crisp results, at each stage that you sew an extra piece of fabric to your template, press it with an iron. Now we'll move on to section number 3. So again, find where section 3 is on the front of your paper, and what we need to do now is place a piece of fabric that's larger than section number 3 onto the reverse, upside down, so that at least a 1/4 inch of the fabric overlaps with the line where we're going to be sewing to create a seam. It's worth taking a bit of time at each of these stages to check that you're happy with the positioning of your fabric. Pin it in place once you're happy with the position, And at this stage you can also just check again by holding it up in front of a window. Now we're going to sew along that line between section 3 and section 1. And with foundation paper piecing, you basically add sections in the order in which they're numbered on the template. So here we've sewn a piece of fabric in place for section 3. We've turned over our paper to sew along the line. And once the fabric's sewn in place, you remove the pin, trim along that edge that you've just sewn with to leave a 1/4 inch of fabric for the seam allowance. This is quite an important stage as foundation paper piecing patterns can be quite fiddly and you don't want them to be too bulky. So trimming that seam at each stage just helps to keep your patchwork nice and neat. Once you've folded the fabric back on itself, press with an iron. And so now we've got sections 1, 2 and 3 in place. So now we'll move on to section number 4. And this is exactly the same as the previous steps. Find section 4 on your template. Flip your template upside down. Get a piece of fabric that's larger than section number 4 and arrange it so the fabric is right sides facing down on top of the previous bits that you've sewn. So you see there, I'm just checking my fabric's large enough. That's how it's going to look, but first to do that we need to sew it in place. So place your fabric so it overlaps the line that you want to sew it to the rest of the shape by at least 1/4 inch. I'm just checking that by holding it up against the light a little. Once I'm happy with the position of piece of fabric number 4, pin the fabric in place. Now again, flip your paper upside down and sew along that line that attaches piece number 4 to the rest of the shape. Once your fabric's in place, you can see the shape starting to form. As in the previous steps, what you need to do next is to just trim along that line that you've just sewn to remove some of the fabric from the seam. Once you've trimmed the seam, press that piece of fabric in place with an iron. Then we move on to piece number 5 of our template. And what we're going to do is add more and more pieces of fabric to our project in the same way, using the same method. Finding the shape, finding a piece of fabric that's larger than that shape, pinning it to the reverse of the paper template, upside down, and then sewing along the line of the template to attach that piece in place. A good tip for foundation paper piecing is, especially when you're starting out, you do need to concentrate quite a lot just to make sure that you position your fabric in the right place. It can be helpful to leave a generous seam allowance on all of your pieces of fabric. So here you can see we've sewn along the line that attaches piece number 5 to the rest of the shape. When you flip your fabric back along the sewing line you've just sewn, it covers that shape. And then we're going to repeat the same stages as we have in the previous steps, which is first of all to trim a 1/4 inch seam along the edge that you've just sewn. It doesn't matter if this isn't exactly 1/4 inches, that's why I do it by hand. And then flip that fabric back on itself Now you've learnt the basic technique, you proceed to add more and more pieces of fabric to the back of your piece of paper, following the numbers on the front of the piece of paper for the order in which you add them. Each time, pin the fabric in place, double check it's in the right position, sew along the front of the template, then trim the seam allowance and press. As you start to add more and more pieces of fabric in this way, you'll see the shape of the foundation paper piecing pattern start to come to life. You can do some really clever things with fussy cutting with foundation paper piecing. Fussy cutting is where you have a patterned fabric and you choose which part of the pattern to show in the space that you're sewing it to create different effects. However, if you're new to foundation paper piecing, also known as FPP, my tip would be to not worry about fussy cutting at this stage and just use some simple patterns or sort of ditzy prints, as you'll find it much easier as you don't have to worry too much about which section of fabric you sew in place. Once you've added all of the pieces of fabric to your template, turn the fabric and the paper upside down, and now you start to remove the paper from your sewing. It helps to use a seam unpicker for this stage. You'll find that as you sewed each piece of fabric in place, your sewing machine also perforated the paper, which makes it easy to rip away. Once you've removed each of the pieces of paper of your template, your sewing is complete. Some paper piecing patterns come with several sections. These are usually lettered, for example A, B, C. If the pattern you're using has several sections, sew each section separately using the technique we've just shown, and then at the very end you'll find you can sew each of the sections together to create one finished picture. Foundation paper piecing is a really lovely and addictive technique, and you can create some really stunning results with it. We hope you found this tutorial useful. You can find the full instructions with step-by-step guidelines and pictures on our website gathered.how. Thank you for watching.